Things happen in our lives, don't they? Painful things, hurtful things, sometimes devastating things. Sometimes we do something dumb or make a stupid choice. Other times we're the victims of other people's stupid choices. Still other times we don't do anything at all. And still the pain comes. In our health, in our relationships, in our finances, hurricane lands, an economy implodes, the diagnosis is received, someone falls asleep behind a wheel. You know, if I were to ask you to write down, take out a pencil and paper and write down the 5 greatest hurts that you've experienced in your life, I'm sure it probably wouldn't take very long for you to write down at least 5, probably more than 5, and have to start paring them down to your top 5. And although I don't really want you to have to go there, I kind of want you to go there. So let's take a minute. Pull out your mental pad of paper and your mental pencil. What hurts? What situations? What events in your life would make your list of top 5? And those hurts, they affect us, don't they? They shape us and mold us, sometimes in ways that we don't even immediately understand, sometimes in ways that seem so disconnected from the hurt itself. Remember when I was in seminary, I took Intro to Counseling, and as part of the class we were told that we had to go and be in therapy ourselves so that our counselees would know that we understood what it meant to open up our own lives. And so I went to my therapist for the first appointment, and she said, well, what do you want to talk about? And I said, I don't know. And she said, well, tell me about your life. And when I was done, she said, have you ever talked about how your sister's death affected you? And I said, no. She said, well, maybe we should start there. I've told you before, I was 3.5 years old when my 7-year-old sister was killed in a car accident. A good friend of our family's was driving her home, and he fell asleep behind the wheel. And you know, I never really thought I always thought as I was growing up, well, how deeply affected could I really have been? I mean, how close could I have been to my sister? I was only 3.5 years old. I mean, I know it was hard on us. I know it was hard on me and hard on our entire family, but I always growing up kind of thought, well, I couldn't have been that close to her. Could I have? Until now that my son is 3.5 years old, and our daughter Ryan is almost 6, and I see how close the two of them are. And I can't even imagine if he was to lose her. Through that therapy, I started to realize that maybe there were some things that were deep inside of me. This visceral fear of death that I had always had, as well as my way of trying to compensate for it by going and getting myself into all of these risky, crazy, death-defying situations all over the globe. That maybe both my fear of committing to any of my girlfriends at that point, my fear of getting too close to people, and my incredible deep love for people and my incredible empathy for other people's suffering might have all been coming out of scars that I received in the wake of my sister's death. The pains of our past, they shape us and they form us. You know, human suffering is particularly intriguing because of how we are so uniquely created to try to find some kind of meaning or reason or purpose, some kind of cause and effect relationship to our suffering. You know, we're the only ones who do this. The animals don't do this. We're the only ones who are always asking, why? In fact, it's one of the reasons that we know that Jesus Christ was fully human, was because even he, when he was hanging on the cross, asked that question. Do you remember? My God, why? He was quoting the psalmist from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? My God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Yet it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth. And since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me. The trouble is near, and there is no one to help. You know, for those of us who believe in God, it just adds a whole nother layer to these questions, doesn't it? God, why are you doing this? Why are you allowing this to happen to me? What have I done to deserve this? What are you thinking? That last question, we have historically have had a lot of pretty scary answers, haven't we? What was God thinking? Answers like, well, it must be because you've done something wrong. Or maybe your parents did something wrong. Do you remember that passage from the Gospel of John? As he went along, he saw a blind man, blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Or in the case of something like 9/11 or Katrina, we say, it must be the country that did something wrong. Or we have other answers like, oh, no, you don't understand. You can't see it now, but your suffering is part of some bigger, more glorious cosmic plan that God has for good. Your child died so that you could get a little closer to God. Or so that you and your brother who are estranged could be reconciled, or so that you could see what the community is capable of doing when tragedy strikes. Oh, you were abused by your dad? It must have been so that you'd be able to help others who are abused when you grow older. As if there isn't anything that happens in this world that isn't willed by God to be part of God's bigger and more beautiful plan. Am I going to really offend anyone in here if I say bullcrap in church? Look, no one ever said that it was going to be easy to be a Christian or to believe in God. Those of us who consider ourselves disciples of this rabbi, this Jesus of Nazareth, who we claim was raised from the dead just this past week, we find ourselves in the unenviable position of trying to reconcile two seemingly contradictory realities, two undeniable facts that have to somehow be held together. The first one is the reality of suffering. Life is difficult, not just for those who deserve it, but for everyone. And often for no apparent reason at all. Matthew puts it this way. God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Job puts it this way: yet man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. The entire book of Job, all 42 chapters, is the story of a man who deserved no punishment, being punished over and over again. It is the story of Jesus Christ, of our Savior, of this Holy Week and Easter that we just finished celebrating, how the one person in all of human history who never deserved any kind of punishment was given the worst that we possibly had to offer. M. Scott Peck starts his book, The Road Less Traveled, by saying, life is difficult. Once we come to terms with that simple fact, everything else becomes easier. We can ask why till we're blue in the face. We can theorize left and right about where our pain and suffering comes from. The reality is that it is a part of our lives. But the other reality is that God comes to us in our suffering. So the scripture says God is close to the brokenhearted. God has a special place in God's heart for those who suffer and will show up in our suffering and be present with us in it if we allow God to. Do you want to know the most frequently stated promise in all of Scripture? It is, I am with you. It's throughout the Scriptures over and over again, the Old Testament and the New Testament. One example is here from the book of Isaiah. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name, and you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep you over. Sometimes this presence comes to us directly through prayer or through a supernatural sense of God's peace and comfort or direction or strength. Other times that presence comes to us through others, through people who are willing to be used as God's hands and feet, who are willing to be used as God's presence in our lives. When I was down in Houston, one of the dear leaders of our church, a man who was an elder, a very successful businessman, this sort of tall, handsome, athletic guy who was just loved and respected by everyone in the church, soon after I arrived, had a massive stroke. He was suddenly reduced to a wheelchair. His arms weren't even strong enough to wheel himself, and so his wife, Virginia, or I, or one of his friends would have to push him around. Before the stroke, he was one of the most articulate people any of us had ever known. He was the one who had led the previous capital campaign at the church. But after that, he was reduced to slurs and mumbles. I think it was my friend Bill Stubbs who suggested that he and I start a small group around Don to give Don some Christian support and fellowship as he was going through all of this. And so we started a small group, and every Tuesday morning we would meet at 7:30 a.m. over at Don's house. And we would read the Bible together, and we'd talk about our faith and our lives, and we would pray together and support each other. And then afterwards, everyone would leave for work, and one of the guys, Walter, one of our retired men, would stay and help Don do all of his therapy exercises that he did. I think it was incredibly helpful, and it was a really important time for Don and in Don's life. And we had had many of the most wonderful leaders of the entire church were in this small group. And then at one point, about a year after we had been meeting together, another one of the men, another very loved person in our church, John, got a phone call on Sunday night that they found his daughter under a tarp out in the woods outside of Houston with a bullet through her head. Her boyfriend had murdered her. And that Tuesday morning, just merely 24 hours later, John called us at Don's house and said, I don't think I can come today. I hope you will understand. I am just too emotionally distraught. And of course we said, no, of course we understand. But Don, hearing what was going on, motioned for us to bring the phone over to him. And so we did. And Don got on the phone and said, John, you have to come. I need to see you today. And so John came. And when he walked through the door, none of us knew what to say or what to do. But Don, obviously getting stronger from the exercises, it was the first time we ever saw him wheel himself over to his front door where John was standing. And he reached out his arms, and John got down on his knees in front of Don's wheelchair. And the two embraced, and they both just started to sob. John said later that through that entire nightmare, he really felt like God was holding him, but he had never felt God's presence in such a powerful way as that morning in Don's arms. I think it was just about a year later. The group was still meeting. Another Tuesday morning, I arrived just a few minutes late to find our whole group huddled around the television set. They were all watching the news. Supposedly, a passenger jet had gotten lost on its way and crashed into the World Trade Center. So we all sat there huddled together and watching the TV as the second jet flew into the second tower. And without one word, we all just reached out and grabbed each other's hands, knowing that the world was never going to be the same, that our lives were never going to be the same. And I know that we all know exactly where we were when we heard that news, and I will never forget that day, but I will also never forget that day because of the presence of God that I felt amongst those men as we learned that news that day. Sometimes the presence of God comes directly, sometimes it comes through others. But it's not just the presence of God, is it? Because the other thing that people have been experiencing for thousands and thousands of years is that when we allow God into our suffering, God can make good things come out of it. Sometimes they're just small things, some little glimpses of grace, some small little lesson or some small little growth that we find. Other times, it's full-on redemption, full-on healing as our lives are turned inside out through our suffering. And now I think we need to be really, really clear here, because just because God can make something good come out of the suffering that we go through, it doesn't mean that that suffering was ever okay or intended or worth it, or that there necessarily was a reason for it. We have to be very clear that that is the correct interpretation of Romans chapter 8. You remember it says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That does not mean that God causes bad things to happen so that good can come out of it. What it means is we live in a broken world where suffering, deserved and undeserved, is a part of our lives. But that if we allow God into that suffering, that God can bring some good out of even the most senseless, even the most horrible of situations. Because the reality is that we have a choice when it comes to our suffering. We may not have a choice whether it comes into our lives, but we do have a choice how we are going to react to it and how we are going to receive it. We have a choice whether our suffering is going to be hamster wheel suffering or pottery wheel suffering. Hamster wheel suffering is the kind of suffering that goes nowhere. It just goes over and over again in our minds. The kind of suffering where we can't stop asking why because we need a reason. We need someone that we can blame, whether that's God or somebody else or even ourselves. We need to be able to blame someone so that we can furor over it in our minds over and over again the entire time, whittling away and chipping away at our hope and our resiliency, making us less and less capable of ever loving and caring and truly living again. That is the redundancy of hamster wheel suffering. But there is another kind of suffering. It's a suffering that we can choose. And that's pottery wheel suffering. The kind of suffering where we understand that in the horrible situations that we have to face, whether we deserve them or not, we can allow God's hands into that situation. We can become more pliable. We can become softer, not more rigid, not harder. We can allow God's hands in to shape us and to mold us and to sculpt us in the midst of our pain. Pottery wheel suffering understands that we may not have the answers of why things have happened. But if we allow God in, God will be able to form us into a new vessel that is stronger and more beautiful and able to be used. Henry Nouwen puts it this way. He says that pain can be like a plow that breaks the ground to allow seed to take root and grow into a strong plant. Every time you experience pain, you're faced with another choice. You can become bitter and decide not to ever love again, or you can stand straight in your pain and let the soil on which you stand become richer and more able to give new life and new seeds. The more you have loved and have allowed yourself to suffer because of your love, the more you will be able to let your heart grow wider and deeper. We don't always have a choice over the pain that comes into our life, but we do have a choice how we are going to react to it. I don't know what those hurts are that are on your list of 5 or 10 or 20, past, present, or future. But I know that there is a choice, because if you allow God into your pain, then God can mold you and shape you and do something about the way that that pain is going to affect you. Turn you into a vessel of deeper beauty and strength. So God, you are the potter, and I am the clay. Come, even into this mess which is my life, and have your way with me.